ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tony Tate. I'm the President of the Jewish Community Council of Western Australia, and we're co-hosting tonight's events with the Friends of Israel Western Australia and the Western Australian Institute of Jewish Affairs. Before we get started, if you could all do whatever you want to do to your mobile phones so that we don't get interrupted during the proceedings, we'd appreciate that. Can I acknowledge Bob Kachira, who's the chair of Friends of Israel Western Australia, Carl Genzel, who's a member of the executive of the Western Australian Institute of Jewish Affairs, Peter Abetz, MLA, a member for Southern Rivers, Marcus Solomon, Rabbi Marcus Solomon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Can I advise you, as you can all see, that Sydney Goodkin is videoing this evening's performance, speeches, talks. It's for the Friends of Israel WA records, but I understand if you wish, you'll be able to get copies of that video. We have two speakers this evening, and I've got the privilege of introducing the first one, not that he needs a lot of introductions, he's spoken a number of times at these events, but let me go through a little bit about him. Kelvin Crombie first became interested in Israel while growing up on a wheat, sheep and pig farm at Babakan near Corrigan in the central wheat belt. The interest developed further when he had uncles serving in the Middle East during the Second World War. He had an Israeli farmer as a neighbour, and then the Six-Day War in 1967 sparked his interest further. He subsequently went to Israel in 1979 and took up residence in Jerusalem, worked initially at a hospital for handicapped children and an old people's home, and he and his family lived in Israel for nearly 25 years, and their 4 daughters were all born there. In 1986, Kelvin was asked to become the guide at Christ Church, the Anglican church in the old city of Jerusalem. Whilst at Christ Church, he developed an intimate and profound knowledge about the history of the restoration of Israel, and particularly the role of the Anzacs in that restoration. And he's published a book, a documentary video and pamphlets on the subject. As the guide, he not only had to lecture numerous groups of visitors, but also had to undertake considerable research. During this research, he discovered a significant number of historical artefacts. These include several large and unique models of Jerusalem, as well as the largest portrait of Jerusalem, the 1879 Jerusalem panorama, and the very special Montgomery Bible, which is on display at the back of the room, and Kelvin tells me is only in Perth now for a short time before being returned. As this research focused much upon the involvement of Britain in the region, Kelvin covered the involvement of Australian and New Zealand soldiers in Israel during the two world wars. This subject intrigued him. His desire to see the Anzac involvement in the region within the broader historical and geopolitical context led him to thoroughly researching the subject and publishing a book entitled Anzac's Empires and Israel's Restoration, 1798 to 1948, and that was in 1998. The book coincided with the release of a documentary on the same subject, produced in conjunction with Peter Darg, entitled The Battle for Zion. Of late, he's also completed, in conjunction with Hatikva Film Trust, a new documentary dealing with the entire story entitled From Exile to Restoration. Kelvin's also published a booklet, Journey to Beersheba, with the background story to the Battle of Beersheba and the reenactment in diary form. The Crombie family have temporarily relocated to Perth, and we're delighted to welcome you here this evening, Kelvin, to talk to us about the Anzac connection to Israel and the Jewish state. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction. And as you can see, I came up without my notes, so it's going to be off the hip, which I prefer anyway, basically. Yes, it's a subject which is very dear to my heart, the Anzac involvement in the restoration of Israel. And hopefully it's a subject that is close and dear to your hearts as well. If by the end of this evening it's not, then I've failed in my duties. But it's my desire to see every Australian person aware of, perhaps even keen about the subject, because I sincerely believe it is one of the most important aspects of the whole Anzac story. Now, if we look at a foundational scripture from the Tanakh, let's say, we look at Isaiah 19, where it speaks about three areas: Assyria, Egypt, and Israel, being a blessing in the midst of the earth. There'll be a highway of peace connecting all three countries. It's a very, very profound scripture. Now, if we look at the areas covered by Egypt, Assyria, and the land of Israel, we'll see that's all the areas of the modern-day Middle East, the areas surrounding Eretz Israel itself. But if we look a bit deeper, we'll see something very, very interesting. And that is, this is the very region where soldiers from our countries fought during both world wars. We were in the European theatre in the First World War, or the Australians, or both of us were. We weren't there in the Second World War. The New Zealanders got to Italy, but they never got to France. In the Second World War, we were in the Pacific theatre, but we weren't there in the First World War, except for the little incursion to take over the German colonies at the beginning of the war. So you could basically say the only common denominator geographically during both world wars was the land of Israel, Egypt, and Assyria. Let's just take it down to the lands of Lebanon and Syria. So from a certain perspective, the Australians and New Zealanders have got a very, very incredible, important heritage right there in the middle of the world, you might say, in the Bible lands. And so I think that's an important factor for us to start with. Oftentimes when we're talking to Australians about the importance of Israel and the restoration and our need to do what we can to make sure that Israel remains a vibrant democratic society, many Australians would just scratch their head and say, oh, it's just Jews and Arabs against each other, what's it got to do with me? So sometimes we actually have to find a very good common denominator, a point that we can actually use in order to be able to speak to the average Australian who's more interested in his big boat and going to watch the Eagles and the Dockers and whatever else they do on weekends. Don't bore me and use my time up with other mundane affairs like world events, etc. So we sometimes have to find that common denominator. And most of you have been to an Anzac service of some nature today. My mate Craig Beach at the back has been to about 3 or 4 Anzac services of one nature or another today. Bob's been to a few. Most of us have been involved in one form or another of an Anzac service today. So there is a common denominator whereby we can actually link Israel with our Australian identity, and that is the Anzac story. The Anzac story begins at Gallipoli. But so too does the Zionist story in many ways, from a tangible perspective. Even though you had the Chovet Zion establishing colonies from 1881 in Eretz Israel, yet as far as a military perspective was concerned, the Zionist entity really got its colours, you might say, at Gallipoli with the Zion Mule Corps, established by Jabotinsky. Okay, but Jabotinsky didn't go off to Gallipoli, because when he heard that it's going to be called the Zion Mule Corps, he thought, what's this muppy dog? Okay, what's the connection between donkeys and the restoration of Israel? So he got on a huff and off he went, and it was left to Trumpeldor. Don't go to Gallipoli. So there was a point of contact already there. The Zion Mule Corps was the first Jewish entity to actually wear the Star of David going into fighting, probably at least since the Bar Kokhba revolt. And so whereas Australians and New Zealanders always claim that it's the beginning of their national identities, well, so too in many ways was it also the beginning of a national military consciousness for the Jewish people. And if you go to the Bet HaGedudim, the Jewish Legion's Museum in Israel, the guide will very, very quickly tell you that the foundations of the modern Israeli army was based upon the Zion Mule Corps and later the Jewish Legion, the 38th Battalion Royal Fusiliers. So there is a very, very incredible connection there at the very beginning. So three nations, in many ways, had a birthing connection to the whole Gallipoli story. Now, even though the Zion Mule Corps didn't serve up in the Anzac zone, a little extent perhaps, most of their fighting was down in the British zone at Cape Helles, yet nevertheless, the soldiers from both those entities, the Anzacs and the Zion Mule Corps, did cross over every now and again. The other important aspect of the Gallipoli campaign that I think we should be aware of and use to the best of our ability is what was happening geopolitically. Now, many years ago, I did a lot of research in the National Archives in London and accessed all the minutes of the British War Cabinet. And I was like a little boy, I'll have to be totally frank with you, going through all these minutes, because in many ways, until that point, I'd always thought that the Western Front was what the British were more interested in, and the Eastern Front, the Middle Eastern Front, well, that was just a side show. But this is not actually the case when you look at the minutes of the British War Cabinet, for instance, because so much space and time and effort was actually given to what will be the future of the Turkish Empire once we defeated them in the campaign in Gallipoli. Because, of course, the British and the French were going to defeat the Turks. There was no question about that at the beginning of the campaign. So if they were going to defeat the British and the Turks, the British and the French were going to defeat the Turks, then the natural next step would be what's going to happen practically to the Turkish Empire. Who's going to take control? And so right at the very beginning, even before our soldiers landed at Gallipoli, already the British War Cabinet and the Allies as well were already debating what was going to be the future of the Turkish Empire. And it's very interesting to note that even before our soldiers went to serve there, the Russians already put their 2 bobs worth in, or the 2, whatever it is they use up there, rubles worth in, and they said, well, once you guys capture it, thank you very much, you have to give it over to us. So in other words, when we went to fight in Gallipoli, we were really fighting for the Russians, because if we captured that area, that entire area would have been given over to Russia. From a geopolitical perspective, it makes good sense, because the Russians certainly did not want the British and the French to have control over the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus. And so at that point, when the Russian Foreign Minister Sazonov sent that declaration through, at that point the British realised, oi voy, we have a problem, because the Russians are going to take control of this very strategic region, which means in the future they could just send their ships in and they could actually mess up our plans in the Eastern Mediterranean region. They could potentially even take over the Suez Canal and cut off our link to our empire. So at that point, the British government realised, well, they had to make sure that the area around the Suez Canal was doubly more secure. They already had Egypt, they had control over the Suez, but they didn't at that stage have control over the east bank of the Suez Canal. Guess what's on the east bank of the Suez Canal? Apart from the sand dunes of Sinai, it's also the land of Israel. So we can see, if we look at the primary sources, that the Gallipoli campaign opened Pandora's box, basically. Began a process which ultimately led to the British taking over the land of Israel, in actual fact, not just Eretz Israel, taking over the entire province of Syria. And it was important that by the time the campaign in Sinai began in 1916 and then into Eretz Israel in 1917, it was important that they did take the entire province of Syria, which is the modern-day country of Syria, Lebanon, of course Transjordan, and Israel itself. It was important that they took over those areas, because then they'll be in the best bargaining position vis-a-vis the Arab nationalist movement and also the French as well. And so behind the whole Light Horse campaign that went into Sinai in 1916 and onwards, there was this other geopolitical factor. Now, a lot of that was sort of in ambiance or abeyance until there was a change of government at the end of 1916, when David Lloyd George became Prime Minister and Arthur Balfour became Foreign Minister. Until that point, the British were still a little bit, they wanted to make sure they didn't upset the French too much. But when David Lloyd George became Prime Minister, he wasn't worried about upsetting the French one little bit. He wanted to upset the French, actually. And so he said, we're going to take over the entire province, whether the French like it or not, and we're not going to use any French troops. It's just going to be British, Australian, and New Zealand soldiers who will do the bulk of the fighting for capturing the entire Turkish province of Syria. That's also for good geopolitical reasons. So anyhow, we see that in the context of the light horse involvement in that region in 1916, there was this other factor of Britain making sure that the Suez Canal region was safe and secure. In other words, the link between Britain and the Empire, which included us, very much so. We were joined by an umbilical cord, very much so at that period of time. Britain had to be sure that umbilical cord was very, very safe. So when we look at our campaign in 1916, the Sinai, and the southern part of Judea in 1917, and the rest of the area of Syria in 1918, we have to understand it in this particular context. The Light Horse campaign was very colourful, with the New Zealanders, of course, as well, and the British yeomanry and infantry, very colourful campaign. But there was a very practical side of it as well, which we have to fully take on board. Now, not everybody was totally happy about this. The French weren't very happy, of course. But anyhow, as it worked out, the French had no choice because the British were actually in the best position, their soldiers being based in Egypt. Now, the crucial battle in the campaign to take the entire province of Syria was in 1917, the 31st of October 1917 in actual fact. Twice before, in March and April of 1917, we had failed in two big battles at Gaza and lost a lot of soldiers in the process. Now, Gaza was the logical place to enter into the land of Israel, but we failed there. The Turks beat us. So there was no choice but to battle somewhere else, to attack the Turks somewhere else, and that somewhere else was going to be in Beersheba. Interesting, of all places it had to be Beersheba, as we call it. Over here you Aussies call it Beer-Sheba. And why the Sheva? Well, Sheva can mean an oath, as you know, but it can also mean seven. And so the Aussies thought, yes, the place is 7 beers. That will do us nicely. So we call it Beer-Sheba. But of course, for us who come from Israel, it's Beersheba. So anyhow, that was the place. But it is the place of the oath. It's the place that Abraham, Isaac and Jacob all either lived or had association with. And of course, you know full well that the covenant that God cut with Abraham was sealed with an oath. And that, folks, is an extremely important principle to keep in mind. So Beersheba was going to be the place where the battle would occur. But what was the use of the British forces under whom we served capturing Beersheba from the Turks in 1917 if there was no tangible political plan or agenda to go with it? Who was going to take control? Who was going to govern the region if our soldiers actually captured it? So on one side of the equation, one side of the coin, there was the actual physical campaign to take the land. But the other side was the political future. And that's where the Zionist organisation came into the picture. The Zionist organisation realised that without Britain's involvement, they would never fulfil their goal of having a Jewish national home or a Jewish state. The British, on the other hand, they needed to have control over that region for geopolitical factors, for the safety and welfare of the British Empire, but they would not be allowed to have control of the land of Israel by themselves. Their allies would never allow Britain to have control over the Holy Land. The French most certainly wouldn't. The Russians wouldn't, okay, because the Russians were the protectors of the Greek Orthodox. The Vatican certainly wouldn't. The Italians wouldn't. And even Woodrow Wilson, the president of basically or mostly Protestant in the United States, also he would not permit the British to have control over the land of Israel, over the Holy Land. So there's a bit of a problem for Britain. How's she going to solve it? Well, Britain needs a proxy. Britain needs an ally. Britain needs to climb on somebody's back. If somebody has to climb on Britain's back, well, they might both be climbing on each other's back. It's probably a better way to put it. And so the Zionist organisation and the British government's geopolitical goals enmeshed just like that. And all that would actually come to fulfilment on the 31st of October. It's very interesting. The British government sort of let the Zionist organisation know, if you submit a request to us, we will take it seriously. And so that's what happened. The Zionist organisation of Britain gave this proposal to the British government. The British government said, oh, very interesting. Yes, we like that idea. Now you go and get all the countries in the world to back us up, to support us. And so the Zionist organisation then had to go out and do a lot of legwork, let me tell you. In Russia, in France, with the Vatican, in the United States, wherever they could go, they went in order to make sure that there was a groundswell of interest. So the culmination of all of that activity, that political activity between the Zionist organisation and the British government, was going to come on the 31st of October 1917. On that day, the British War Cabinet was going to meet in London And there they would discuss this proposal by the Jewish organisation of a Jewish national home in Palestine. So you see what's happening? Two things are happening on exactly the same date, the 31st of October 1917. The British, the Australian and New Zealand soldiers were going to fight against the Turks and hopefully win. And the British government, the British cabinet was going to have a cabinet meeting to discuss this idea, this proposal from the Zionists of a Jewish national home in Palestine. The rest, you know, is history. We won the battle. And when I say we, it's not just the Australians. Okay, so if you patriotic Australians out there, I'm sorry to say this, but in actual fact, most of the hard fighting on the 31st of October was not even done by the Australians. Most of it was done by the British. And so when you read certain stuff, it says the British lost and went off with the tails between the legs and the Australians came in and did the work. That's all rubbish. The British did actually most of the fighting on that particular day, and the Australians galloped in at the end after the New Zealanders had done their great job of clearing Tel Aviv, and the Australians galloped in and finished up the day. It's like the sub coming onto the game of footy in the last minute, kicking the winning goal. Okay, great that he did it, he gets cheered and carried off, but don't forget the other guys who done the hard work during the day. So it was a combined British, New Zealand, Australian effort, okay, which captured Beersheba. On the same day, at about the same time in London, the British War Cabinet was making their decision. They voted unanimously to accept the Zionist organisation's proposal, and they accepted the idea of having a Jewish national home in Palestine. Incidentally, only one person voted against the idea. Do you know who that one person was? Sorry to say this, it was the only Jewish guy that was on the cabinet, Sir Edwin Montague. No more comment needs to be said. The rest of the guys. So the guys won that one. Okay? But anyhow, the fact is, while the sovereignty of God, and through 300 years of history within the evangelical church in England, there was a very strong sympathy within British circles for this concept of the restoration of Israel. But folks, it wasn't just that. It was pure geopolitical common sense. Britain needed to safeguard the link to the Eastern Empire. She couldn't do it by herself. The Jewish people wanted to be involved. Voila, the two shall become one. Therefore, the Aussies were in part, and the Kiwis were a part of that process as well. I don't have the time to go into the remaining aspects of the First World War, but as you know, by the end of the war, the entire province was captured, right up until the border with Anatolia, and that therefore gave the British a very, very good position to be able to determine how the area would be apportioned afterwards, with the San Remo Conference, and then later the Treaty of Lausanne, and so on and so forth. And then the League of Nations, on July the 24th, 1922, unanimously decided to bestow the mandate for Palestine on Britain to therefore bring into fruition their promise of a Jewish national home in Palestine. So that was a legal document that was signed and voted on by Australia and New Zealand on the 24th of July 1922 to establish a Jewish national home, incidentally to the west of the Jordan River. So you can see that as a result of our fighting in that region in the First World War, we actually provided a platform for the Jewish national home, ultimately. Not entirely us, don't forget, there was the efforts of Jabotinsky and Trumpeldor and the Zionist organisation, yes, entirely. However, our soldiers were still there. And so therefore we can actually look at it from a certain perspective and say, Australia and New Zealand helped to prepare the way for the establishment of at least the foundations for the ultimate Jewish state. But you know the story as well as I do, if not better. Things didn't actually get that better after 1922. It wasn't so easy, first of all, to get the Jewish people into the land that was needed to establish a solid infrastructure, and secondly, through the influence of Hajj al-Min al-Husseini and the Arab nationalist movement, and then later the rise of Nazism, lots of efforts were made to actually nullify the concept of a Jewish national home in Palestine. So we get to the period of the Second World War, and we have a very, very interesting dynamic happening. You've got a very, very strong Arab nationalist movement. You could almost say Islamic fundamentalism to an extent, because Hajj al-Min al-Husseini was the mufti, the spiritual leader, the Muslim spiritual leader, and he therefore was able to gather up lots of Muslim sentiment behind this idea of eradicating the Jewish national home. There was that on one side. Over here there was Nazism in Europe, and the designs of the Nazi Party to destroy the Jewish people in Europe itself. And it was to be hoped that those two entities would not actually converge, because it would make it extremely difficult not just for the 500,000 Jewish people who lived in Eretz Israel, but indeed for the 700,000 Jewish people who lived in that entire region. Unfortunately, those two entities did converge, but they didn't converge straight away. When our soldiers first went over there into that region, there was peace initially because Italy had not as yet joined the war, had not yet joined officially with the Germans, even though they were in cohorts with each other. But after the fall of France, then the situation changed dramatically. Because at that stage, Italy, that had controlled Libya, then made an attempt to capture the Suez Canal. At the same time, they made an attempt to capture Greece. And so suddenly the entire Middle Eastern region was thrown into a furor, was turned upside down, you might say. And now there was serious concern for the 700,000 or so Jewish people that lived in that region. The most serious concern, though, was for the Jewish people who lived in Greece. Because in Greece, there was about 56,000 Jewish people who lived in Thessalonica to the very north, as well as Jewish people living elsewhere. So if for any reason the Italians conquered that region and the Germans came in, that would be a very difficult predicament for them. In 1941, the British government sent a force into Greece, with the idea of protecting Greece from an expected invasion by the German forces. And that force that we sent was 58,000 soldiers opposing 200,000 German soldiers. Okay? Look at the odds. What's going to happen? Our soldiers went right to the very north. This is Australian soldiers from the 6th Division, as well as New Zealanders and British soldiers. We went right to the very north, and we were actually protecting Thessalonica, which had 56,000 Jewish people living in it. When, however, the Germans broke through and captured Thessalonica on the 9th of April 1941, the fate of that Jewish community was sealed. By the end of 1943, or not even before the end of 1943, some 96% of that Jewish population of Thessalonica had been transported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And so that gives you a bit of an idea of what was going to happen to Jewish people in any area which was overrun by the German army, because the SS would come in straight afterwards and would implement their policy. This was before Wannsee, but nevertheless their policy was still to send in the SS and the Einsatzgruppen, the murder squads, to shoot the Jewish people in those areas taken over by the German army. Not a very pleasant situation. So you can imagine how the Jewish people living in those regions of Libya, Egypt, Israel, Palestine at the time, Syria and Iraq were feeling. So this was a very period when Rommel came in, began to win victory after victory, and began to move east towards the Suez Canal. Hence we see the importance of Tobruk. Had Tobruk fallen very quickly, there would have been nothing stopping Rommel's forces going straight through into Egypt to the Suez Canal. We have a gentleman here called Craig Beach. His father was at Tobruk, and I'm sure there were others who had family members that were there. So now we see the bigger picture, why it was so important that Tobruk was held. Now, simultaneously to this, there were events elsewhere which didn't involve the Anzacs, but very much involved the Jewish people. Because at that stage, there was a coup d'etat in Iraq, in which a pro-German government took control and immediately asked for German assistance, immediately asked for Hitler and the German High Command to send assistance down, which is military assistance, to help them to defeat any British incursion. And you can imagine what was going to happen, potentially to 100,000 Jewish people who lived in Iraq, most of whom lived in Baghdad. Believe me or not, it was a very, very tight situation there in 1941 in Iraq, and I can say, Be'ezrat Hashem, the Germans never arrived because the British were able to get in there and to defeat that our Arab army before they could take complete control with the Germans. So there was a near thing there. Wherever you looked in that period of time, there was disaster or potential disaster. We were defeated in Greece, we were defeated in Crete, and then we began to be defeated in North Africa as well. 1942, Tobruk fell. Disaster, and Rommel's forces began to move towards Egypt, towards the Suez Canal, and they came to a place called El Alamein. At the same time, the SS High Command in Berlin, Himmler and Hitler had a meeting. There's no minutes of that meeting, but soon afterwards the SS put together a specialised murder squad called the Einsatzkommando Egypt, headed up by a man called Walter Rauff, who had been involved in atrocities himself. And so this murder squad was to then come down to the Middle East, join up with Rommel's forces, go into Egypt and the conquered areas, and together with Arab collaborators begin to do what the Anzac group had been doing already in Europe, which was to destroy the Jewish communities. So these things, folks, were actually happening. At the very same time as our forces were beginning to come against each other at El Alamein, you had this murder squad ready, waiting in the wings. And so hence the importance of the victory at El Alamein. Now, I've had the pleasure in my time in Israel to interview many people, including Yitzhak Rabin, Uzi Narkis, and others who were alive at that time, who all said exactly the same thing. Had the Allies lost at El Alamein, it would have been disastrous for us. The good news for us is that that did not happen. The Australian 9th Division, the 2nd New Zealand Division, the 1st South African Division, the 51st British Scottish Division, and many other units as well. There were Czechs, I can't forget to mention the Czechs that were there. I'll get clobbered later by Bob. And there were Free French, and there were all different sorts of smaller units. They were all there, folks, but the point of the matter is the German Italian forces did not win at El Alamein. And so the Jewish communities east of El Alamein could sigh a big sigh of relief. How relieved were they? Well, shortly later, the Jewish community presented Montgomery, when he came on a visit, a gift of gratitude. This was an official gift of gratitude from the Jewish leadership to Montgomery. It was a beautiful little Bible. And with this Bible, there was a little inscription in Hebrew and in English, and it said, "To Field Marshal Viscount Montgomery, the gallant leader of the victorious British forces, by whose hand God has placed salvation in Zion in the days of El Alamein." God has placed salvation in Zion in the days of El Alamein. Folks, that's an official gift. Those are official words from the Jewish leadership. They understood the importance of that victory at El Alamein. And so we can see that in the context of the Second World War, soldiers from our two countries and from South Africa as well, and from Britain and the other countries, played a pivotal role in helping to make sure that the Jewish national home was not destroyed. And as a result of that, on the 29th of November 1947, the United Nations could actually take a vote amongst all the member nations to establish in that area of Palestine, as it was known at the time, to establish both a Jewish state and an Arab state. Had the Germans broken through, destroyed the Jewish national home, there would have been no opportunity for them to have done that. But in 1947, there was the opportunity of having both a Jewish state and an Arab state. Australia voted in favour, so too did New Zealand. The Jewish community were in favour of having it. Unfortunately, the travesty of history was the Arab leadership, both in Israel or Palestine at the time and the countries around, failed to accept the United Nations decision. And so we have a travesty happening thereafter. But the folks, the important thing for us to see from this little exercise, and if you want to know more, there are materials down the back, is the role that we have played as two nations. There have been negative aspects as well. It's not all positive, there are a few negative aspects. Okay, the Evian Conference being one, and the decision by Prime Minister Lyons in 1939 to go with the whole idea of finishing up the Balfour Declaration, etc. So there were negatives, but generally speaking, there is a positive picture that's there. We have to make sure we take hold of that, utilise it, understand the facts and figures first and foremost, but also make sure that the work that our soldiers did is not undone now by the decisions of our government and the people of our lands even today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelvin. Amazing that you can get through all that and remember all the facts without the notes. For everybody's interest, Kelvin has some of his publications, all of his publications available at a table at the rear of the hall, and he'd love to talk to you afterwards, I'm sure. Before I call on our next speaker, can I ask everyone to rise, given the talk we've just had, and we'll observe a minute's silence in honour of Anzac Day and those veterans who fell. you. I now call on Rabbi Marcus Solomon, who's going to introduce the next speaker.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can I firstly join with Tony in saying what a fantastic presentation that was again, Paul, and I heard you on the last occasion, and it was enthralling both times. And we're very fortunate to have you with us to make those presentations. It's my pleasure and honour to introduce Akiva, open bracket Andrew, close bracket Hamilton, according to the literature I've received, who's our special guest this evening. Akiva is with the Shurat HaDin-Israel Law Center. Shurat HaDin means letter of the law, literally in Hebrew. He's an Israeli-based Shurat HaDin is an Israeli-based civil rights organisation and world leader in combating terrorist groups and the regimes that support them through lawsuits litigated in courtrooms around the world. Akiva joined Shurat HaDin after a career as a solicitor in Melbourne. He has a history of successful litigation against injustice, both in Australia in a corporate environment and then in Israel, fighting for the interests of justice for Israel and the Jewish people. Since joining Shurat HaDin, Akiva has exposed Australia's largest charity, World Vision, as using AusAid provided taxpayer dollars in Gaza to fund an arm of the proscribed terrorist group, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. In addition to extensive press coverage, the breach of criminal anti-terror provisions and misuse of taxpayers' funds is being pursued at the legal and political levels, where it is becoming a hot issue in Parliament. Andrew was, in some senses, a latecomer to the cause, and having sort of Googled him, I've realised that he's come both to the cause and to Judaism a little bit later than some of us, but has certainly perhaps done more in that short time than others might do in a lifetime. So we're very honoured to have him with us. Can I say that exposing this sort of thing is an ancient Jewish tradition? Those of you who are familiar with the Haggadah, which is the text we read on Passover, at the Passover meal on Pesach, will be familiar with the statement that the Haggadah makes about anti-Semitism. And it's a famous and rousing statement that we make on the night of the Seder. And we say, it's not only Pharaoh that we remember, for in every generation they rise up against us to destroy us. That is sadly true. But in addition to that, the Haggadah says something quite curious. It compares the wicked Pharaoh to what it regards as the first and original anti-Semite. Now, if you turn your minds to who would you think was the first and original anti-Semite, you might have thought it was Pharaoh, but the Haggadah suggests that Pharaoh, A, wasn't the first, and B, wasn't as bad as the first. The one the Haggadah regards as the first and the worst was Lavan, or Laban in English. And that's a rather curious choice, because if you read the biblical text, he doesn't really, if you read the biblical text at least quickly, he doesn't come across as such a bad chap. He was Jacob's father-in-law, and he didn't enjoy good relations with Jacob, but he wouldn't be the first person in history not to enjoy perfect relations with a mother-in-law or a father-in-law, and he has what seems to be a few justifiable gripes. And yet the Haggadah regards him as the prototype anti-Semite. And why is that so when you look at the text and he doesn't appear to be such a bad chap? It's because if you look at the text more carefully and read the words that come out of his mouth with attention, you'll see that this person who adopts the guise of somebody reasonable is in fact a very wicked man with very wicked intention. And the rabbis of the Talmud analyse his words with great care to bring that out. And that's perhaps why the Haggadah regards him as worse than Pharaoh. Because Pharaoh did us a favour He, like others today, tell us what they want. They want to destroy the Jewish people, and they make no pretense about those intentions. But others seek to present themselves as in favour of peace, and social justice and equity, and it takes analysis and attention and care to expose them for the wicked anti-Semites that they are. And that's why the Haggadah sees Laban, as more dangerous in some respects than Pharaoh. And that is the very important work that Andrew Akiva and his organisation Shurat HaDin does. It exposes what appear to be charities, social justice organisations, for the real agendas that they have that are inimical and dangerous to the Jewish people in the State of Israel. So you are part of a holy and ancient tradition, Andrew, and we're very, very pleased to welcome you here this evening.
Thanks so much, Rabbi. I am honoured and privileged to speak here today on the evening of Anzac Day. As a former Australian soldier, reservist, didn't actually do any fighting, but I'm very honoured to speak here today because, as Kelvin has so eloquently explained, and what is not well understood in Israel or in Australia, is the enormous contribution, military contribution, to the foundation of the State of Israel, the restoration of the State of Israel of Australian troops. And as a former soldier and also as a lawyer, when I made Aliyah to Israel, I was already far too old to make any military contribution, and very fortunately Israel is very well served in the military context today. And it's interesting hearing Kelvin speak about, the British Empire and the British taking over the area of Eretz Israel and the surrounding area, and to think something that I observed recently, that today the Israeli armed forces are 6 times the size of the British armed forces. Today, Britain only fields 82,000 combat troops and Israel fields about 700,000 combat troops. How times have changed. How privileged and lucky we are today as Jews, and also some of us as Israelis, to live in a Jewish state that is militarily secure from traditional, armed attack by traditional conflict. We are so privileged today, and we must remember how privileged we are and how much we have to thank Australian, New Zealand and British troops, as well as Israeli soldiers of the past, to maintain that security and continue today. But in my other hat, as a lawyer, that is where the real threat exists to Israel today. Our enemies have been unable to defeat us militarily. The threat of a German army or an Arab army coming and overtaking the State of Israel and lining up Jews and shooting them like the Anzac group did throughout Europe, that threat, at least for the moment, is past. Israel is very strong militarily and is able to protect itself from conventional armed attack. But the battlefield has changed. Terrorism, asymmetrical warfare, and delegitimisation, anti-Semitism, that is the battlefield we fight today. Just as in the period leading up to the Balfour Declaration, there was great support in the world for the concept of a Jewish state in the historic Jewish national home. Today, the forces that array against us, the forces of Pharaoh and Lavan, of anti-Semitism, they have recognised that they cannot beat us on the battlefield. They can conduct terrorist operations to try and undermine our will, to make our life unpleasant, to attack in a non-fair fight, in a cowardly way. But they can't defeat us on the battlefield. Where they're trying to attack us is in delegitimisation, boycott, divestment, sanctions and terrorism. All these things really fit together. because that is where the battle has fought today. And that battle has moved into what is, I'd have to be honest, my far greater skill set. I was not a fantastic soldier, but I'm a much better lawyer, thankfully. So what I wanted to talk to you today is about Shurat HaDin, the Israel Law Center. The Israel Law Center's modus operandi and raison d'etre is bankrupting terrorism one lawsuit at a time. Unfortunately, terrorism has been the scourge of the Jewish people and in fact the Western world, as we saw recently in Boston. And the question is, what can we do to fight terrorism as non-soldiers? Clearly there are some military options with terrorism, but sometimes they're not ideal because terrorists hide behind civilians, because they hide in civilian societies, so that military options are not always feasible. But what the Israel Law Center realised, what Nitsana Darshan-Leitner and her husband Avi Leitner realised, is that terrorism requires money. Contrary to concepts amongst leftists in the Western world, a person doesn't just sort of get up one day, a Muslim get up one day and decide they want to be a terrorist. You know, it takes an enormous amount of money, time and preparation and planning in order to conduct a terrorist attack. So Shurat HaDin decided that it can attack terrorism through attacking the money trail. The concept came from the Alabama-based Southern Poverty Law Center, who successfully bankrupted the Ku Klux Klan by bringing a series of legal actions against the Ku Klux Klan in the United States. And this concept, Nitsana Darshan-Leitner, when she was a young lawyer, came across this concept and took this pioneering model of taking action on behalf of terror victims and their families against those nation states, those organisations, those commercial organisations, banks, telecommunications organisations, whoever is involved in allowing the terrorist money trail to the money to get from states like Iran and Syria that support terror, getting it to the terrorists, training the terrorists, anyone that's involved in that. If we can target legally, and fortunately since 9/11 there have been many laws passed in the Western world that do allow legal targeting of organisations and people and nation states that assist terror. So the track record is this. In the 10 or 12 years that Shurat HaDin's been going, Shurat HaDin has won $1.3 billion in judgments on behalf of victims of terror against nation states and organisations that have been supporting terror. And it's been successful in collecting, and collection is not the only measure of success, but collection is important, collecting about $120 million on behalf of terror victims. Now, the purpose of this is threefold. Firstly, by attacking the terrorist money trail, it makes it much harder for the terrorists to conduct operations. It makes it much harder for Iran and Syria to get their money to the terrorists, because what it means is that any money that they have in Western countries can be collected in satisfaction of these judgments. The second thing it does is a very important thing, which is it allows terror victims to fight back. If tragedy like a terrorist attack has befallen your family, it's an absolutely devastating thing. Lives are torn apart. But what can one do? What can one do, particularly from a Jewish perspective? Well, when tragedy has befallen you, the most positive thing you can do is take action to prevent similar tragedy befalling somebody else. So these victims of terror, by participating as plaintiffs in cases brought primarily in the United States against Iran, against Syria, against the Palestinian Authority, organisations that have been funding terror, they give the terror victims a chance to fight back. And they also, finally, thirdly, give a sense of justice. Because to have a court recognise your pain and suffering, recognise who was responsible for inflicting that pain and suffering on you, and putting that in a judgment that then can be acted on, that creates a sense of closure that's very important psychologically. A sense of closure and justice that's very important psychologically for terror victims. So that is the bread and butter work of Shurat HaDin, the Israel Law Center, and that work's been ongoing. It's had quite a lot of success, both monetarily, as I mentioned, $120 million in actual collections, about $600 million in terrorist assets have been frozen. And according to Israeli security services, our actions have helped reduce terrorist activity in Hamas-controlled Gaza by 60%. Shurat HaDin has also been involved in using the law in other innovative ways to confront terrorism and its fellow travellers. We all remember the Mavi Marmara flotilla incident. Terrorists, together with misguided humanitarians, tried to break the legal Gaza blockade and bring medicines and things which were all out of date and could have been got through the Israeli border to Gaza to create a political scandal. The IDF was not properly briefed. They sent their soldiers rappelling down from helicopters onto the ship armed with paintballs, guns, and waiting on board were terrorists with guns, knives and iron bars, and they immediately set upon the soldiers and ripped their guts out and were very nearly killed, a number of them. And amazingly, the Israeli soldiers, the special forces, were able to fight back, kill the terrorists and regain control of the situation. In a perfect world, that should have been the end of the story. But of course it wasn't, because it was a public relations disaster for Israel. And for the enemies of Israel who don't care about human life, it was a success that they got a whole lot of their people killed in a way that caused damage to Israel. So Shurat HaDin thought about, how do we stop a flotilla without use of military force? How do lawyers stop a flotilla trying to get to Gaza? And we thought about it. Well, ships exist within an international legal regime. Ships have to have insurance. They have to have maritime communications, including emergency communications, without which they can't leave port. And they have to have permission from the departing port to leave, in this case, Greece. So Shurat HaDin started writing to the insurance companies and saying to them that by insuring these ships which are involved in terrorism, you are in breach of US anti-terror law. And to the same to the telecommunications companies, the Inmarsat, that provide communications, satellite communications to the ships, that them providing services to these ships is in breach of US anti-terror law. And then finally, going to the Greek authorities and saying, check on all the paperwork of these ships, they may not have it in order. And we successfully got the insurance pulled from a number of these ships, the telecommunications pulled, and the Greek authorities wouldn't let the ships leave. The second flotilla was sunk in the water without a single shot being fired. And the Israeli Navy had actually approached us before this to get some assistance. So, what better way to stop terrorism than using the law? Clearly, sometimes terror has to be fought with force, but if it can be fought using non-violent means, and the law is a non-violent means, how much more preferable is that? That is the idea of Shurat HaDin, is fighting the attacks on Israel through lawfare. Not warfare, lawfare. Lawfare has certainly been used a lot against Israel, but Shurat HaDin is at the forefront of using it in Israel's defence. There were problems of Israeli officials, Israeli military officials and government officials being threatened with lawsuits when they visited the UK or Spain. So Shurat HaDin fought fire with fire. we brought an action in a Spanish court to bring war crimes indictments against a Spanish official and embarrass the Spanish so that they dropped the similar indictments against IDF soldiers. We've forced companies, businesses and universities to disconnect from suspected terror affiliates out of fear of civil and criminal liability. We've caused Iran to have to bring its assets out of Europe. So by thinking outside the square, we have used the law and are continuing to use the law to fight terrorism. What I have been involved with is extending this concept to fight against not-for-profit organisations that are funding terror-linked groups and to fight against boycott, divestment sanctions, to fight against what Vice President Joe Biden, US Vice President Joe Biden, recently calls the most pernicious and dangerous threat to Israel that he experienced in his 40 years of public life. So it's not just us as Jews that are worried about delegitimisation. The US Vice President has recognised this as a very serious threat. The Anti-Defamation League and the Simon Wiesenthal Centre have recently come out with reports that have stated unequivocally that boycott, divestment, sanction is at core anti-Semitic. And so we are working to take action in this area as well. Now, in Australia, the most high-profile thing that I've been involved with is exposing Australia's largest charity, World Vision, for their funding using AusAid taxpayer-provided money of an organisation in Gaza called the Union of Agricultural Work Committees, the UAWC. When I first joined Shurat HaDin, I got a piece of information from Avi that the UAWC was connected to the illegal terrorist group, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Now, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, has a 45-year history of terror, from the Lod Airport massacre in 1972, the Hakoah Club bombing in Sydney, which now seems to have been pinned on the PFLP, to the murder of Jews in the family in Itamar when the family was murdered, including the baby. These have been PFLP terrorists. To bombings of sold supermarkets in Israel back as far as 1969. And guess what? The president, for the period in which World Vision and AusAid funded this organisation from at least 2005 to 2011, they're continuing to fund this organisation, the UAWC. The president of this organisation is a convicted terrorist. He was convicted and served a lengthy sentence for involvement in the bombing of a supermarket in 1969, which killed a number of Jews. Contrary to what World Vision said, he has not reformed at all. He has been on the forefront of attacking Israel and continues to be a leader, a senior leader in the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. I did this research. Basically, I went and I found the list of directors of the UAWC, and I did Google searches and found information on them, including a lengthy arrest record for the president, Bashir al-Kiri, a lengthy arrest record starting with his conviction for terror in 1969, including arrests in, I think, 2001 and 2003 and 2011. And I want to show you, there's nothing better than video. And are we right with the video? What we have here is a video of 2005 of Bashir al-Kiri, who at the time was the president of the UAWC, which was receiving close to $1 million a year from the Australian taxpayer via World Vision. He's speaking at a Hamas conference in Ramallah, and you'll see that he's identified as a senior leader of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. You'll see from his words what sort of person this person is. In this video, you'll you'll hopefully get to see that he calls for the capture by Hamas by violent means of Tel Aviv, of Jaffa, of cities not in Judea and Samaria, but core cities in Israel. We also discovered that the vice president of this organisation is also a senior member of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and that 3 other directors sitting on the board are members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. We found that they shared that the so-called charity, the UAWC, allowed its offices to be used by the PFLP for its 42nd anniversary celebrations. We found that every time the UAWC had a conference speaking about the supposed plight of the Palestinian farmer, guess who was a head speaker at this conference? The public affairs guy, or even perhaps the president of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. These organisations are inextricably linked. In fact, the UAWC was established by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine originally. So we had an organisation that was established by, was controlled by directors controlling the board, worked together with a prescribed terrorist group, prescribed illegal under Australian law to directly or indirectly give assets to this organisation. So we presented this information and presented an extensive dossier with, I think, 37 separate pieces of evidence linking these organisations. And I have to say that the response from the mainstream Australian press and the Australian government has been absolutely appalling. They have basically tried to cover this up. The response from the Foreign Minister to this evidence was not to address any of these pieces of evidence, not to say, oh no, you know, this is wrong or that's wrong or something's changed or you've made some mistake. No, his response didn't address any of the evidence. Instead, he said, oh, but the UAWC is registered as a charity in Israel. And he repeated this in Parliament. World Vision repeated this a number of times. And so we said, let's have a look at this. We can't find them. So we did research. We did some more research. What we discovered was that, firstly, the UAWC is a Palestinian organisation. It exists under the auspices of the Palestinian Authority, which is a completely separate legal jurisdiction from the State of Israel. Secondly, a Palestinian organisation such as the UAWC, and we're talking about an organisation with a budget of over $10 million a year. This is a big organisation employing hundreds of people. Okay, this organisation can't be registered in Israel because it's a Palestinian organisation. What instead had happened was that the UAWC had got one of their operations people, not one of the director level people who's involved with the PFLP, but one of the cleaner operational people who happened to be an East Jerusalem Arab and thus entitled to establish an Israeli not-for-profit organisation. To establish an Israeli not-for-profit organisation by a similar name as a front. The organisation that's registered in Israel, we got its records from the not-for-profit registry, has a budget of about $10,000 a year, not $10 million a year. It has a completely different set of directors. It's a completely separate legal organisation legally. It can't possibly be the same, and functionally and operationally, completely separate organisations. The UAWC, the organisation that the Australian taxpayer is giving money to, the organisation that has 5 terrorists on its board, including the Vice President and President, that organisation is not registered as a charity in Israel. And our Foreign Minister has misled the Parliament. He's misled the Australian people about this issue. And when we provide all this evidence to them, what do we get? Stum. Nothing. through the auspices of the Jewish community in Sydney, we entered into negotiations with World Vision. I met with World Vision's General Counsel, their legal advisor in Sydney. We tried to come up with some sort of settlement, some sort of solution, because they wanted to continue what they considered their good work, their good project in Gaza. And our attitude was, well, we're not so sure about the project, but if you want to continue the project, you must continue it under the auspices of an organisation that is not tainted and involved in terrorism, that is not effectively an arm of a prescribed terrorist group. We, over the past 6 months, it was a very slow process, we entered into negotiations. We found other organisations in Gaza. They're hard to find, very hard to find organisations in Gaza that are untainted by terror. Because Hamas controls Gaza, it doesn't really make it all that easy for any organisations that's not a terrorist organisation to operate there. But we did find and was able to suggest to World Vision some other organisations that they could run their project with. I met with the head of World Vision, Tim Costello, and their legal advisors in Tel Aviv a couple of months ago, expecting that we were going to come to some sort of mutual resolution about this issue. But instead, at the last minute, they decided to bring in an Israeli lawyer that didn't have really, I mean, this is really not an issue for Israeli law, it's an issue for Australian law. An Israeli lawyer has a history of defending the Bank of China against Shurat HaDin's legal actions for the Bank of China, knowingly allowing money to be transferred to Hamas. So we know what sort of lawyer he is. Brought him in, said, oh, we've got expert opinion from Professor so-and-so. I can't remember the name offhand, but Professor so-and-so is well known as a ultra left-wing flake that has no credibility in mainstream circles in Israel. They said, we've got an expert report that says it's okay. And I said, face to face to Tim Costello, I said, what about this evidence? What do you say about this piece of evidence, and this piece of evidence, and this piece of evidence? What do you say about Bashir al-Kiri, who is the president of this organisation, who's a convicted terrorist and is continuing to be involved in terror? Oh, he's a bad man, but we have to do good work in Gaza. That's what he said to me. I said, what about all this other evidence of all these other directors? Stum, nothing. A complete refusal to confront the evidence. We've seen this stonewalling from World Vision. We've seen this stonewalling from our foreign minister. This is a matter far more serious than salacious phone calls between members of parliament. This is far more serious than the football results. This is a very serious matter that Australian taxpayers' money is going to an organisation that is closely associated with and arguably actually an arm of a prescribed terrorist organisation. What do we get? Stum. We get nothing. So we're continuing the fight. We're getting together better evidence. We're seeking to back up evidence that we have from press reports with actual criminal investigation files. We've discovered that other UAWC directors have subsequently been arrested. I think about 6 of them have been arrested in 2011, 2012. The Israelis are after. Are we on? Okay. And we're continuing to collect evidence. And frankly, we're waiting for an opportunity to be able to bring this matter up again in a political environment where there is a willingness to actually look at the truth and take responsibility. One of the fundamental precepts of Judaism is one is responsible for one's actions. If one does something bad, you can't say it's good because some expert you've employed to say something says so. It's really quite an indictment on the public culture in Australia at the moment. And it's an indictment that the mainstream media, with the exception of Greg Sheridan, who's written an article, that the mainstream media has generally not wanted to touch this issue. Why? Because World Vision spends so much money in the Australian press on advertising and has such a halo around it that they don't want to rock the boat. Unfortunately, it's a case of the big lie. But we are continuing, and it pleased me that Rabbi talked about this, the Jewish tradition of continuing to get into the detail and expose this anti-Semitism. Are we ready to go? Okay, this is Bashir Al-Kiri, the president of the UAWC, that your taxpayers' money has been going to fund this organisation for the last 7 or 8 years.
وغزة أيضا ليست كل فلسطين، ففلسطين لا زالت محتلة، القدس محتلة، الجدار أحالنا إلى جزر معزولة، والمستوطنات انتهبت غالبية الأرض الفلسطينية، وحق العودة متآمر عليه. حيفا ويافا واللد والرملة، الجليل والنخب هم أيضا فلسطين، وبدون كل فلسطين لن يكون هنالك بحر للاحتلال. الإخوة والأخوات والعرب أنظمة والمسلمون أنظمة يهرولون اليوم دولة مصر دولة، نظاما وراء نظام، للتطبيع مع هذا الكيان العنصري المسخ. ارحموا شهداءنا أيها المفرطون، أنظمة إسلامية وعربية، القدس تذبح من الوريد إلى الوريد، وفلسطين محتلة، وأنتم تطبعون أيها الخونة، أيها الحكام الأقزام، ستدوسكم أقدام شعوبكم، لكننا ماضون بإذن الله.
So we can stop now. You'll notice that the Hamas leader from the West Bank, who was arrested shortly after this rally, is the next speaker. So you get the idea of how big this guy is. You know, he's, one of the #1 people in the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine. So this is the sort of person we've been giving close to $1 million a year to. This is the sort of organisation he heads. So that's what the #1 issue that I have been dealing with in Australia, but I've also been involved in other things for Shurat HaDin. I've been involved in trying to get judgments that we have on behalf of terror victims in America recognised in Europe, so that we can then go after Iranian money in Europe, because Iran still has a lot of money in Europe, particularly in Germany. I'm also involved in trying to bring legal action against boycott, divestment sanctions. We've determined a case in New Zealand where we'll keep it to the Anzac field of play. In New Zealand, the New Zealand Super Fund, the government superannuation fund, a government superannuation fund with, 10 billion or something under management, announced a few months ago that it was divesting from Israeli companies such as Africa Israel, Elbit and Shikun Banui. And it was divesting from them because they were building in the occupied Palestinian territories, and they were involved in building the security fence. Now, they made a public statement. This is a public financial institution. They made public statements that are misleading and deceptive on many aspects. Firstly, they said that they took into account New Zealand's votes in the Security Council against the security fence and against settlements. Well, we checked the Security Council records. New Zealand, firstly, there's been no Security Council resolution against the security fence at all. There hasn't been a resolution against settlements since 1980, and New Zealand wasn't on the Security Council at any of those times. In fact, the issue has never come before the Security Council while New Zealand sat on the Security Council in 1993-94, which is the only time it sat on it. But fundamentally, and this is where we come full circle back to what Kelvin was speaking about earlier, fundamentally, we want to highlight that not only are settlements not illegal, but in fact settlements are the right of Jewish settlement of Eretz Israel, including all of Judea and Samaria, all of the land of the British Mandate Palestine, is enshrined in international law. It's enshrined in international law that started from the Balfour Declaration, which of course happened at a similar time to the Australian Light Horse having a significant contribution. I have to be careful, I'm very bad at overplaying the Australian contribution, but having a very significant contribution in taking the land of Israel out of the hands of the Turks, out of the hands of Dar al-Islam, as the Islamists would say, that out of the hands of the House of Islam. And that culminated through the San Remo conference in the Palestine Mandate of 1922. Now, there is much confusion about this issue because people think of it as the British Mandate. But in fact, it wasn't a British mandate. It was the Palestine Mandate, which was an international treaty which says quite explicitly that the right of Jewish settlement of the land is guaranteed, and that only Jews are to have political rights, that the civil and social rights of non-Jews are preserved, but only Jews are to have political rights in these lands, and that Jews have a fundamental right of settlement in all this land, which originally include all of today's Jordan, but certainly includes all of Judea, all of the Gaza, the West Bank, and the Golan. And this is an international treaty that was agreed to by all 51 members of the League of Nations at the time. Now, why is this important? Because New Zealand was a member of the League of Nations at that time. And in fact, the agreement to this mandate, this international treaty, was one of the first things that New Zealand did as an act of its own sovereignty. New Zealand and the other colonies signed on to the League of Nations treaty inset under the Commonwealth, under the British Empire. But it was at this time that New Zealand and Australia and other colonies started to create their own sovereignty. So we have a New Zealand government organisation, and it's a private organisation, but it controls government super funds, saying that they're divesting from Israeli companies who are building houses in an area that by international law Jews are not just entitled, but there is a sacred trust for them to be able to build houses. If there wasn't such a treaty, there would be nothing wrong with Jews building houses in Judea and Samaria, like there's nothing wrong with building houses anywhere. And in fact, to say that you could build houses for Arabs and not for Jews, which is the implication of saying settlements are illegal, is itself enormously discriminatory. If Israel said you can build houses for white people but not for Maoris in certain parts of New Zealand, or the other way around, it would be accused of racism, and it would be against the anti-discrimination law of many countries. So we are looking to use the anti-discrimination law. We're looking to use the misleading and deceptive conduct provisions to go after particularly commercial organisations that continue to put out in the public space the lie that Israel is occupying, that settlements are illegal, and all these sorts of things. We're going to go after these people because it's very important to get back and state very clearly in the public sphere that Israel is not an illegal occupier, that building houses and Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria is perfectly legitimate as long as the civil rights of existing residents are protected. And building a Jewish town somewhere on land that Jews have bought legitimately, and Israel's always been very careful to not allow Palestinian privately owned land be used, and that's where certain housing has been knocked down when that's the case. Go back to this issue because we have to be fighting. We cannot be fighting on the defensive. We have to be fighting on the attack and say our rights to this are enshrined in international law. New Zealand, UK, when you say settlements are illegal, you yourself are illegal. The United Nations, in its charter, in its founding document, has in Article 80 a grandfathering clause that grandfathers existing rights of people that existed under prior international law, i.e. the Palestine Mandate. And it was actually Bibi Netanyahu's father who was instrumental in getting that clause included in the UN Charter. So from a legal perspective, and I'm a lawyer, for a legal perspective, everything the UN has ever done that has sought to undermine or criticise Jewish settlement or Judea and Samaria is completely unconstitutional. It's ultra vires. It has no power whatsoever. The UN itself is illegal under international law when it does that. So we want to fight this fight, and we want to fight it in a context of misleading and deceptive conduct law in New Zealand, as it turns out. We're also involved in trying to bring action under anti-discrimination law because essentially boycott, divestment, sanctions is anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism is illegal. It's illegal to racially discriminate against someone, to say that a professor can't visit a university because they happen to be Israeli, because they happen to be Jewish. To say that, you know, a concert shouldn't be held in Israel because they're Jewish. And fundamentally, BDS attacks the vulnerable, small Israeli businesses. They don't stop using Intel products, even though Intel has, I think, 25% of Israel's high-tech exports, which is 50% of its overall GDP, is from Intel. You know, all the computer chips that are involved in all your computers, the internet, everything on the internet, it's all Israeli technology. But they don't stop using that. They're not instituting a boycott that would be a legitimate a boycott that would be consistent. No, they're hypocritical. They pick on Max Brenner and people selling Dead Sea salts. They bully people working in a mall. It's pure anti-Semitism. At core, it's anti-Semitism. So we're seeking to attack that. We also train the future generations of lawyers. We have an internship program where we bring lawyers from all around the world, not just Jewish. In fact, I had some excellent Australian lawyers from Monash University, non-Jewish, who came to work with me and helped me on some of these campaigns. We have Americans come. We also have a regular missions to Israel, which we call the Ultimate Mission to Israel. The next one's coming up in June, and then another one in October, where you can get to meet, have briefings by intelligence branches and security services officials. You can get to see the trial of a terrorist in the military courts, visiting the Prime Minister's office, plane flights in the Galilee, all sorts of really interesting stuff, which is a bit different from, you know, a different take on an Israel mission. So I encourage you that anyone that might be interested in that's maybe, you know, already done a JNF mission or a UAA mission is looking to get a different take and do some really interesting things, different things, to find out about the mission. Now, I have this brochure, which unfortunately is sitting at the print shop, which we couldn't get delivered, but we will make this available. I think through Steve, there's a lot of copies of this brochure, which has a lot of information about Shurat HaDin. It has this is you probably can't see this photo, but this photo is one of our lawyers in America serving proceedings on former Iranian President Mohammad Khatami in a New York federal court. We had to serve proceedings. You have to serve it personally in the United States. Khatami was coming on a speaking tour, so we got one of our non-Jewish sounding named lawyers to go and book a ticket to this dinner that was held by the Council of American Islamic Relations and say, you know, hello, and by the way, you're served with these proceedings. So we think outside the square. We've taken action against a lot of banks, and we've had a lot of success in cutting off in making banks responsible, including correspondent banks that allow transfers through their bank, through America, responsible for any money that's transferred to a terrorist organisation. And Nitsana Darshan-Leitner last year won the prestigious Moscowitz Prize for Zionism. So the work of Shurat HaDin is being increasingly recognised. I'm very proud to be working for Shurat HaDin and to be able to speak to you tonight on this very important day. And I hope that what I've had to say, combined with what Kelvin had to say, has given you a holistic picture of both the historic military and today lawfare fight against terrorism, against anti-Semitism. And I'm happy to say that there's another Aussie in the office as well, from the Liebler clan in Melbourne, who made Aliyah some time ago. So we've now got an Aussie contingent, just like the Anzacs, you know, provided a small but important part of the victory in the Battle of Beersheba. We hope that we're providing a small but important part in the victory against terrorism and against delegitimisation and boycotts in the lawfare battle for Israel.
Thank you. Keith's agreed to answer any questions if there are any out there. Yes, Ruth.
I was just wondering if there's any legal aspect to the Israel apartheid campaign on campuses.
Yeah, look, Shurat HaDin's very involved in confronting this. Actually, in the United States, we've established a hotline for students to report anti-Semitic incidents, reports this Israel apartheid thing. We've taken action against Columbia University, and we're very involved in taking action, particularly in the US on university campuses, against this boycott, divestment, sanctions, Israel Apartheid Week stuff. Yeah, we're very involved in that, and we're always looking for the right opportunity. As one of the things I spent a lot of time looking through all the different horrible anti-Semitic boycott, divestment, sanction things that are happening, and trying to find the one that is going to fit into the right law and, you know, the right place to bring legal action against these people. Yeah.
Kelvin, Melanie, Kelvin, could you just hold a minute? Because Melanie wants to have a word.
Just on that note, I'm not sure if you're aware that the Student Council of the Sydney University has just adopted it, and I hope you guys can find that.
Look, I am aware of that. It seems like the Australian Jewish community is getting, you know, taking a lot of action itself on that. The issue with that one is the mere passing of a resolution is probably not necessarily illegal, but the implementation of it is most certainly illegal. And in fact, there was a case in the UK about similar boycott, divestment sanctions at the University Union in the UK, and a case was brought, and the case basically was found that it was illegal to implement them, these sorts of things, but it wasn't illegal to necessarily to debate them. So that is, you know, we're watching that. It's the same as with boycott, divestment sanctions in Australia. Under the Trade Practices Act, these sorts of boycotts are illegal, and the ACCC even basically said that these boycott campaigns would be illegal if they were having any negative commercial effect. But the ACCC found, and I think it's probably true in Australia, though not necessarily in other places, that the boycott, divestment sanctions has actually increased the sales of Max Brenner and Ahava products and things because the counter campaign's been bigger. But if they were ever successful, if basically the message to the boycott, divestment, sanctions people in Australia is, if you're ever successful, if you ever actually cause any real commercial damage, we're going to sue your pants off. Okay? Because the ACCC's already said it's illegal. It's quite clear it's illegal if there's any substantial damage. And that's all that's missing from the legal case. So let's hope there never is any substantial damage, and actually what they do is create more custom for Israeli companies. But if there is, we'll be ready to take action. Kelvin.
Now, I'm sure I think there are quite a few Christians in particular might be concerned about this world vision situation. who makes I'm here today. Do you have any strategy or any way of being able to help Christians know how best to actually present the case to the world bishop?
Look, I mean, I'd be very interested in talking to you about Christian connections to get this information out. The reality is that it's been well covered in the Israeli press, it's been well covered in the Australian Jewish press, but we've been unable to get any significant coverage in the mainstream Australian press. We're very interested in trying other methods to get our message out, particularly, as you say, to Christian audiences, and I look forward to talking with you after about organisations that, or lists or whatever, to get this information out, because in today's world, the reality is that the mainstream media gives a very biased picture of everything, not just Israel. I mean, everything. They've got a particular lens, and if it doesn't fit in with their worldview, they just won't publish it. But we're lucky today. There's the internet, there's Twitter, there's blogs, there's all sorts of different ways to get information out to people. And yes, very interested in looking at.
Michael. You spoke about Bob Carr's attitude to this issue. What is the attitude, do you think that attitude of a likely next foreign minister after the elections?
Well, we're quite hopeful in that regard. Look, the federal opposition, including the office of Julie Bishop and Tessa Gambero, have been very involved in this issue. They have been raising questions in Parliament, doing what oppositions do. I think there's at least 3 occasions that in the Senate they have raised this issue. There's 13 pages of Senate transcript of Bob Carr being grilled about this by Senators Forshaw and a few others. So I'm hoping that their very supportive attitude on this issue will continue, if and when they win government, and I won't comment on that issue from the podium.
We'll finish it there. Thank you. Thanks, Akiba. And can I say the brochure, when it does arrive, Friends of Israel will let you know that it's available and arrange for it to be distributed to those who wish to read it. So thank you very much. Now, I'd like to call on the Chairman of Friends of Israel, Bob Jewry, for a vote of thanks.
Well, thanks, Tony, and today is a special day for me anyway as an Australian, so it's a great privilege to listen to 2 outstanding speakers this evening. In fact, I came directly here from the last Anzac ceremony of the day in Australia, which is at Anzac Cottage at Mount Hawthorn, which was the first war memorial built in Australia after the First World War. For those of you who don't know, you should visit there. It's a magnificent cottage that was built in a day in honour of a person who was actually wounded at Gallipoli and has been faithfully restored by the Vietnam Veterans Association. Firstly, can I thank very much our old friend Kelvin Crombie. Kelvin has a unique way of weaving and winding together history in such a way that it shows very much that connection between us and Israel. And when I say us, I'm talking about Australia and Israel. I had the great fortune to visit the battlefields of Beersheba with Kelvin a number of years ago on a parliamentary delegation. And I think whilst I stood on that hill looking down from the armoured memorial for the Jewish armoured corps, looking down on the battlefield there, and as Kelvin related the story of the charge at Beersheba, the hair was standing up on the back of my neck and I could hear the sound of the hooves as they came over the hills. It was an incredibly moving experience. And today just proves, again, that they didn't die in vain. That everything that was done on that day and everything that was done subsequently has led to the birth, if you think, of 2 nations. It was only 14 years after the birth of the Federation of Australia that our soldiers were fighting in the Holy Land. And again, that led to the birth of a second nation, and we have much to thank those groups for, as Calvin has outlined, for the birthright of both our nations, the nation of Australia and the nation of Israel. So once again, thank you, Calvin, for your contributions. But I've got to say one thing, it wasn't the British that did all the fighting, it was the Welsh. It was the Welsh regiment. The Welsh regiment that were following up right behind the horses. I just want to let you know, Boyle, that there are even today some divisions in England, but still. I just needed to correct that. Lawfare and not warfare. What a great saying. What a tremendous saying. And we were privileged also to see two great lawyers on the podium tonight, and that was in Marcus Solomon and Akiva Hamilton. And after 35 years as a police officer, I was devastated when my son joined the enemy and became a lawyer. So, Akiva, that was a very insightful and sensible way of presenting something in an unemotional way that affects us all. It doesn't just affect Israel, it affects us as a nation too, that people can twist and turn issues around to suit their own agendas. I was reminded today of one of the things that I did as a police officer. As a serving police officer, the only lottery I ever won was the one where my number didn't come out to send me to Vietnam, but many of my mates did. And it was interesting that in 1970, at the height of the Vietnam War, when my mates were dying and being dreadfully wounded, and I think of Graham Edwards, who I stood alongside today, that my key role with the police department at that time, after having been trained by the American State Department, was to combat terrorism in our own town, in our own city of Perth. And I was deeply involved in the arrest of a couple of people that ended up trying to bomb the Labour and National Service Department, an act of true terrorism. But the interesting thing is, and something that was never made public at the time, was where the funding was coming from for those organisations. And it was quite eerie tonight to listen to Akiva talk about the money sources, because the money sources were no different. Even during the Vietnam War, those same groups, those same global groups that were financing some of the anti-Vietnam demonstrations in Australia were being funded from very different means to what we were used to. And as an investigating officer, it was quite interesting to see how easy it was for those groups to access money from these overseas organisations. So in some ways, nothing has changed. It is disturbing, however, if evidence is produced to see a major Australian charity organisation, particularly having met Tim Costello and knowing him as a person, I would hope that he would be deeply concerned that any monies that were raised on behalf of humanitarian programs are being used in a way that it wasn't destined for. And in that way, Akiva, Andrew, I urge you to keep up the good fight in that regard. Thank you also for taking the time and trouble to fly for, I think, 34 hours to be with us tonight. That's a sterling effort, I've got to say. Well done. I'm also reminded at the end of the day, when you spoke so much about the United States, that the only way they got Al Capone was through taxation and money. So keep going, I might tell you. A wonderful way to go. But also, the other thing that really struck me, and I'll finish on this note, was the efforts that you're taking on behalf of the victims of terror. I spent some 35 years dealing with victims in my previous life and realising that the law in many ways does not recognise the victim, does not recognise the issues that go on when you become victimised, and particularly when it is a faceless group and a faceless organisation that is the driver of of the crimes against you. So well done on that regard too, and more power to you and more power to your organisation. I did have the opportunity a few years ago to be briefed by your security people in Israel on the work that was being done. So keep up the great fight. And thank you both once again for being here. I might say too that Friends of Israel, Melanie designed this on our behalf just recently, and it's very timely that Akiva is here today talking about these. There was one of those on each of your seats. Please take it with you, and it does give you some of the arguments that Akiva raised tonight in relation to settlements. And I might remind you before I do finish of the three principles that we stand by. That's why, again, we were delighted tonight to be involved with the WA Institute of Jewish Affairs and the Jewish Community Council through Tony of Western Australia to be part of this evening's event. Thank you once again, all of you, for coming. It's been a long day. I think I saw the first of you this morning at about 4:30 at the dawn service, and again, I'm still with you at this time of night. You'll be getting used to me after a while, I suspect. But thank you once again for attending tonight. To those three organisations, to Tony, to Phil Samuels and the committee of the Friends of Israel, and to the Great School of Carmel, Fiamma, thank you once again for helping tonight with the organisation. And to our sterling IT person who persisted, well done. You got there. Finally, Akiva, Andrew, I wish you well on the rest of your tour. Please talk loud and long and make sure the message has got out there so that we can be and continue to be friends of our great friends in the Middle East, Israel, to make sure that they continue to be a democracy the same as us. Well done and good night. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes this evening. Both Kelvin and Akiva will be here at the back of the hall, and don't forget Kelvin's books are there. Thank you.